Good evening. My name is Emily Underwood. I'm the Community Initiative Specialist at the Missouri Historical Society. Thank you so much for joining us virtually this evening for our STL History Live program, The Angolan Civil War 45 Years Later, with Marcelina da Silva, and presented in collaboration with Bilingual International Assistance Services and the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center. And I do want to thank both of those organizations for all of their work in putting together tonight's program. We really appreciate it as we mark the UN Day in support of victims of torture. And I've posted both of their websites in the chat, so please make sure to go there and click on those links to visit their sites and learn more about all of the good work that those organizations do. As I mentioned, tonight is part of the STL History Live series. We host that 2 to 3 times per week. So be sure to check out the full lineup. You can find that on our website, which is mohistory.org, or under the events section on the Missouri History Museum Facebook page. And our next program coming up is tomorrow at 2 p.m. It's part of our virtual tour series called CSTL. And the tour is Streets of St. Louis Broadway with Community Tours Manager Amanda Clark. Before we get started with tonight's presentation, I do want to take a moment to express some gratitude. So first, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our members. We're so appreciative of your support now and always. It really helps keep programs like this series running. And if you're not a member, but you enjoy the things we offer and you're interested in learning more about our membership program, you can also visit our membership page on our website, which is also posted in the chat. So please feel free to visit there. And I also want to recognize the support of the Zoo Museum Tax District with a really sincere thank you to everyone here in the St. Louis area for your tax contributions. Thank you. After the presentation, we will have some time for Q&A. You can submit your questions through that Q&A button that's in your toolbar, probably at the bottom of your page. Some people, it might be at the top of your page. We'll get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have, so we'll do our best for you there. We also have some bonus material to share with you today, which includes a timeline of Angolan history and a list of some recommended additional reading. I will email that to everyone who's logged in here tonight by tomorrow morning. Maybe tonight, but probably by tomorrow morning. And the link for the Angolan history timeline is also posted on the event listings on Facebook and on our website. So you can find it there as well. And if you want to go back and watch this program later or share it with somebody who couldn't be here tonight, it will be posted to the Missouri Historical Society YouTube channel and it will go up on Monday. So please be sure to look for that. Just a couple final things. We are providing closed captioning today. You can turn the subtitles on in your toolbar if you would like to use them. You should be able to find them. Sometimes there's a button that says turn on subtitles, and sometimes you have to click on something that says more. So you might need to play a little bit, but they should be able to do that. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, we would love to get your feedback. You'll notice at some point during the program, a tab will pop up in your browser with a very short survey. Should only take a minute or 2 of your time. So please be sure to fill that out after the program and let us know what you thought. And with that, I would love to introduce you to our speaker this evening. I'm so appreciative that Marcelina da Silva is able to join us today. Marcelina's family fled from Angola in 1976 to the neighboring country of Namibia, where she was born. And they fled to escape the violence and turmoil that was playing out in Angola when warring factions were competing for power after independence from Portugal. So Marcelina and her parents and her 5 siblings arrived as refugees in the United States in 1990 and settled in St. Louis. She went through school here. Of course, we have to say she went to Nerinx Hall. That's where she graduated high school, and later graduated from Webster University with a master's in international relations. She went on to further her education at Columbia University in New York City, where she studied public administration. And since then, she's held various positions with the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State, including as a Foreign Service officer assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Luanda, Angola in 2013. And she's with us this evening to share her really uniquely personal and professional lens on the story of the Angolan Civil War and where things are now 45 years later. So thank you so much. And Marcelina, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. I really appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen so that you all can see my PowerPoint presentation as I speak. But I also want to thank Bilingual International Assistance Services, the Holocaust Museum, and of course, the Missouri History Museum for the opportunity to observe this day in support of victims of torture. As Emily said, my name is Marcelina da Silva. I was asked to speak about my personal experiences in Angola because I've been to post-war Angola at least 3 times in 10 years, between 2003 and 2013. I would have to say the first trip was by far the best, but each trip was amazing and informative. So this is my opportunity really to give you my personal impressions of the political, social, and economic environment in Angola during these trips. They took place in 2003, and then the second trip took place in 2006 into 2007, and then the third in 2013. But in effect, I'm speaking as a foreigner, making observations that may be completely different from those living in Angola. The final disclaimer is that the views expressed throughout this presentation are my own and do not represent those of the US government or other organizations. I have something of a unique perspective. I was born a refugee in Namibia, south of Angola, where my Angolan parents fled during the 27-year civil war that ended in 2002. I spent my early years in Namibia. Then we lived in a refugee camp in Botswana, just east of Namibia, southeast of Angola, for a couple of years before immigrating to the United States, right, in 1990. My understanding of the atrocities that took place in Angola after independence was very much colored by my parents' experiences before and during the war, but also by my studies and subsequently my career. So my parents told us a lot of stories about what they experienced during the war. Although I suspect they probably left out a lot of the more traumatic details. I know that they personally witnessed summary executions. My father himself was almost killed by a UNITA shooting squad. UNITA was then considered a rebel group or opposition, but are now a political party. And family members disappeared. So I have that firsthand connection to events, but I also have, I think, a good grasp of the Western narrative because I went on to study international relations, political science, human rights, and refugee and migration movements. I've worked in various positions for the US government for about 15 years. I also worked for international organizations while studying abroad in Geneva, in Switzerland. So I've traveled extensively throughout Europe, Africa, and even to pre-Civil War Syria. So before I describe my trips, I'll give a brief, or attempt to give a brief history of Angola and the wars. I understand that a more detailed timeline has been made available to you on the History Museum's website. This is one of my first slides. And this is usually where Western history of Angola starts, with the Portuguese. They first came to Angola in 1483. They were looking for gold, but by the early 1600s, they began to forcibly transport Angolans to work as slaves in Brazil. And they sent almost 5 million Angolans over the next 200 years. So after slavery ended in the mid-1800s, thousands of Portuguese stayed in Angola. They opened up businesses, they confiscated farmland, and they were generally Portugalizing Angola. Now, my mother talked about growing up in a colonized Angola, which wasn't 100 years ago. Angola gained its independence from Portugal in 1975, so 45 years ago. And she described Portuguese apartheid practices as worse than that of South Africa. Angolans were forced to live in the outskirts of cities without running water or electricity, with no real opportunity for jobs, but they still had to pay taxes. Often there were raids in which Angolan men were taken from their homes at the break of dawn and sent against their will to work on plantations for a year at a time. Some were sent outside of the country to islands like Cape Verde. And those who were sent outside of the country never returned. The Portuguese ridiculed and discouraged cultural and linguistic practices of native Angolans and taught Angolans that their history and culture were inferior. The state schools were really only for the Portuguese until the fight for liberation started in the 1960s. And even afterwards, it was still very difficult to attend one of these schools if you were not completely assimilated into the Portuguese culture. So only the missionary schools provided education for Angolans. There was a secret police that tortured and disappeared Angolans during this time, especially the educated class, because they saw them as a threat. So my mother, who was a teacher in the late 1960s, was petrified that she would be caught teaching anything but the approved curriculum, right? Even though she never discussed politics in her classroom, her students nonetheless already started talking about independence and pride of their heritage, which was a really dangerous thing to discuss and to be surrounded by. So moving on to the wars, the Angolan War for Liberation from Portugal officially began in 1961, and the Portuguese finally relinquished all their colonies, including Angola, in 1975. By then, 30 to 50,000, but probably more people had died in the fight for liberation. And at least 500,000 had fled to neighboring countries like Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Civil war came next, and it was between political factions, mainly the ruling MPLA party and the opposition UNITA forces. And it was for control of Angola. It probably started before independence, the rivalry. So during the Civil War, Angola was a Cold War battleground. The US and apartheid South Africa at the time backed UNITA, while the governing MPLA received support from the former Soviet Union and Cuba. 27 years and multiple peace accords later, it took the UNITA rebel leader's death in combat in 2002 for the war to finally come to an end. So here I have pictures of the liberation struggle in the early 60s, as well as some captured Cuban soldiers captured by the UNITA forces. And the picture on the lower right-hand corner is of UNITA's leader, Jonas Savimbi, who was killed in 2002. He met with President Reagan in the White House in 1986. So by the end of almost constant war from 1961 to 2002, 80% of the country lacked access to medical care, 60% of the country lacked access to water, 30% of children were dying under the age of 5, and life expectancy was around 40 years old, which is how old I am. Thousands of unexploded landmines were still a threat, and they still continue to be a threat. As for the wartime atrocities, some estimates suggest that at least 500,000 and up to 3 million civilians died during the war, and more than 1 million were internally displaced, including countless many who vanished or were victimized in other ways. They lost limbs from landmines, they were tortured, raped, or conscripted as child soldiers. In fact, there's really no way of knowing the true death toll and the extent of the abuses against civilians during that time period. But we do know that almost everyone was touched in some way by the conflict. About 2 million people fled to neighboring countries like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and my parents fled south to Namibia, which at the time was under an apartheid regime because it was a protectorate of South Africa. So it must have felt to my parents like they got out of the frying pan and into the fire. So as soon as we heard that the war was over, we started planning our first trip to Angola. In 2003, my mother, my 2 sisters and I traveled to Angola. My oldest sister was born in Luanda in 1975, but it was the first time for myself and for my younger sister because we were born across Angola's southern border, right? So it was the first time a mother had returned to Angola since fleeing in '76. It was the first time seeing her siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, her stepmother in 27 years. The stories we heard, the connections we made on both my mother and father's side, and the adventures, really adventures we had traveling through the largely undeveloped rest of the country made this, I would say, the best experience I had in Angola. We witnessed people's hope and joy wherever we went, even to the poorest households. We didn't have a chance, though, to appreciate the degree of poverty. In fact, before we came, they warned us against coming. They didn't want us to come because they thought they couldn't host us like they wanted to. But they kept us so well fed and distracted that we really couldn't notice or appreciate the poverty. For example, as soon as the airplane doors opened, we smelled that burning trash in the air. And we sort of went through customs very apprehensively, and we were met with like so many family members charging us. And this must have been at 4:30 in the morning. So they stayed up all night, you know, and to have little old ladies trying to pick us up. We were easily distracted by a lot of things in Angola to dwell on the situation. I can tell you that all the government services at that time were at a disarray. Trash wasn't being picked up. People struggled to get proper documentation. Everyone seemed to have their own hustle or negocio in Portuguese for a living, usually selling something or providing service like taxi rides. People were exchanging money in the marketplaces, not in the banks, especially US dollars, which were more stable than the local kwanza. Money changers sat under these big rainbow umbrellas in the marketplaces. They were most often Congolese and probably more reliable with a better exchange rate than the local banks at the time. We also went to Malange. So picture on top of the kids sitting around and having lunch was in Malange. We flew to the interior highlands town. This is like the plateau town where my mother was born, and we stayed there with my great aunt in a tiny concrete building with none of our usual amenities. I'm pretty sure I got malaria or paludismo. I have a picture of that too. Feverish and cold at the same time, walking back from, I believe, the cemetery. That's me in the center with the pink headband. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure a lot of things happened that I wasn't expecting. We saw the devastation that the war had caused, for example. There were buildings that were completely riddled with bullets. We drove back from Malange to Luanda, and it took 3 times longer than it should because the roads were in horrible condition. But I will tell you that none of these things that would normally make for like a horrible trip, none of it sullied it for us because we were so incredibly starved for extended family connections and incredibly grateful for the hospitality. We really felt that we belonged. We also took a boat ride on the Kwanza River to Mishima. Mishima is a place where the Portuguese built a church on the site of where a miracle is said to have occurred. So the church sits right on the river. It's beautiful, it's picturesque. And that's where all these pictures were taken, including this one of me trying to wash some dishes in the river, but squealing as little fish tried to nibble at my toes. Really, they were just trying to get the food that was coming out of the pots. And these 2 little girls just looked at me like I was an alien from a different planet. They were awesome. They helped me do the very basic tasks that I should know how to do. I want to now read to you. So we're still talking about 2003 Angola. This is an excerpt from the Guardian British newspaper. It's an article from 2003, and I think it just highlights exactly what was happening in Angola at the time. So it says, in the lottery of natural resources, there is something almost unnatural about Angola's luck. Offshore crude oil fields are yielding almost 1 million barrels a day, a volume expected to be doubled by new discoveries. Inland lies one of the world's richest mineral reserves with enough deposits of embedded diamonds to produce several million carats a year. There is also iron, platinum, manganese, copper, phosphates, and gold. The soil is fertile, the vegetation lush with a varied climate and a population of only 14 million, occupying a landmass twice the size of France. It could be the region's agricultural superpower. The wasting of so much potential makes Angola an African tragedy in a class of its own. 3/4 of the population live on less than $1 a day. 1 in 3 children dies before the age of 5, life expectancy is 45, and some 2 million people are in danger of starvation. Cities and towns are no more than desolate wrecks where the fortunate have plastic sheeting to make a roof. On to the second trip. Second trip took place in December of 2006, and at this time, all 7 of us traveled to Angola. I have 3 brothers. And this was their first time meeting our extended family. And similarly, they had nothing but great things to say about the trip. My personal impression is that we went during a more politically sensitive time. The Angolan government had promised to hold national elections that year, and it would have been the first since 1992, the middle of the war. It seemed that any public criticism of the government or the ruling party MPLA or then President José Eduardo dos Santos was really not tolerated. And in fact, we were discouraged by family members to discuss politics in public. Angola was in the midst of an economic boom, so double-digit GDP growth that was only really evident in and around Luanda, the capital city, because oil prices were high, they had critical support from China. The picture to the right is my sister and I walking up to the fort, the old Portuguese fort in Luanda, and in the background you can see the number of cranes just dotting the skyline. So there was a lot of building happening. We continued to have a great time with family. This is a picture of just really great fun and dancing on a beach near Luanda, despite the shabby surroundings. We visited the coastal city of Lobito also, which underscored just how little of the tourism sector was developed. Not only was it unsafe for foreigners, Angola still did not have a real tourism infrastructure. The bus we boarded tried to fit extra passengers. They blocked the doors with luggage, and so you couldn't use the doors the entire time. So what people did is jump out of the windows to relieve themselves behind a tree anytime the bus stopped along the way. So this is a picture of my siblings and I in front of an apartment building right on the beach. This is a beautiful location, not a lot of people, and even a little bit of, I would say, ghost townish at the time. And of course, Angola was still undergoing massive family reunification efforts from the war at this time. I think something like 11,000 children were child soldiers or held for other reason in UNITA's army by the time the war was over. The Angolan government was attempting to codify into law who was and wasn't a national and get a grasp on its diaspora population, because so many people had fled during the war. And this excerpt is from the Human Rights Watch World Report from 2007 that described events in 2006. It's very short. It says, economic prosperity and post-war rehabilitation is visible in the capital, Luanda, but it has not reached the rural provinces. Poor Angolans continue to be forcibly and violently evicted from informal settlements in Luanda to make way for development and beautification projects by the government and private companies. The third trip, I couldn't believe my luck when I was posted to Luanda as a Foreign Service officer working in the political and economic section of the US Embassy. This was in 2013. Although I looked forward to an enriching 2 years in Angola, an immediate illness curtailed my tour, so I was medevacked back to Washington 35 days after I arrived. I was disappointed, to say the least, but I also realized that despite all the comforts of home that the US government could provide, that was still my least favorite experience, largely because I felt so distant from family there. I had a 4-bedroom apartment in a newly built building in the center of town. It was an elevator and a pool and gym and 24-hour security. But it was also the first time that I could witness the immense disparity in wealth from the other side. So when I visited Angola before, we stayed with various family members, and most of them lived farther away in neighborhoods farther away from the city center, very modest conditions. I never minded that. But this time I really got this sense that individuals with means seemed almost to be waging class warfare and attempting to solidify their social and economic status. And I always felt that that was for no reason, really, because there has always been enough wealth in Angola for everyone. It's a very resource-rich country. For example, Angola offered to bail out Portugal, its former colonial occupiers, during the 2008-2009 banking crisis. That's how rich it was, but greed, corruption meant that very few people had access to vast wealth. For example, in 2013, January of 2013, Isabel dos Santos, who is pictured here clapping behind her father, then President José Eduardo dos Santos, she became Africa's first female billionaire. And earlier this year, a consortium of investigative journalists found, kind of unsurprisingly, that her wealth was largely due to the access her father gave her to land, oil, diamonds, and telecom deals. So meanwhile, 30% of Angolans live in poverty on less than $2 a day. One of my cousins in 2013 drove me around to see the cities the Chinese built outside Luanda. I believe one of these is Quilamba. The government's attempt to relocate people living in the shanty towns in Luanda to these sort of unserviced cities further away. I saw how Luanda City was increasingly being cut off or made inaccessible to non-wealthy and non-business, non-expatriate members. Another cousin showed me what had become of the Ilha. The Ilha is the little peninsula that juts out from the Marginal, which is the Luanda's coastline that juts into the Bay of Luanda. So in 2003, when I first visited, it was a quaint community, with fishermen and various stalls selling goods for tourists. And when I visited in 2013, it hosted Miami-style nightclubs and restaurants for the ultra-rich. It was disheartening. But I also had an opportunity to witness the degree of need in the health sector. That was part of the reason I was medevaced in the first place, was due to Angola's dire health scene. And really, any expatriate with a potentially serious condition, including a toothache, was getting medevaced. Many Angolans who could afford it made their way to South Africa, to Namibia, to Cuba, or elsewhere for healthcare. I saw firsthand how access to government contracts drastically changed how people lived. Family members I visited in 2003 who didn't have indoor plumbing in the span of 10 years had acquired like the latest of any kind of gadget appliance, nice cars, homes, private security, and maids. It was kind of amazing. And this excerpt is also from Human Rights Watch. It's a report that came out in 2013 entitled "Take That Filth Away, Police Abuses Against Street Vendors in Angola." This is a picture we took from one of the residences we stayed at. It's Zungueira, one of the street vendors. So this excerpt in Human Rights Watch reads, street vendors in Luanda experience daily roundups by police who routinely use excessive force and subject traders to humiliating and degrading treatment. They also regularly confiscate goods and extort bribes. Such violence and public humiliation, often inflicted in view of numerous witnesses, includes beatings with batons and other objects, kicking, slapping, and punching, resulting in injuries including bruises, swollen arms, legs, and faces. So, on to present day, Angola. I think I'm almost out of time. When José Eduardo dos Santos, one of the longest lasting presidents in Africa, finally stepped down in 2018, a couple years ago, it was after 38 years in power. But after he left, it sort of ushered in a new era for Angola that has meant increased accountability efforts, anti-corruption efforts, greater tolerance for human rights, etc. Still, there are a number of rights groups that point to some worrying indicators of abuses against civilians that continue, including the level of xenophobia, especially against the Congolese, and increasingly against Muslims. Also some tendencies by the security forces to tamp down aggressively against protesters, particularly against activists in Angola's exclave to the north, Cabinda, and a vast socioeconomic disparity that often has led to like blatant acts against the poor. And I'm talking about mass forced evictions of residents and farmers. For example, Islam is not an authorized religion in Angola, and mosques are not allowed to operate in most parts of the country yet. There have been forced repatriation of refugees and mass deportations of perceived illegal immigrants to the DRC, and especially at a time when they still face threats there in the DRC. There have been arbitrary arrests and attacks on civil liberties like peaceful protests and freedom of speech. There have also been some positive developments in the meantime, one of which is that they decriminalized same-sex conduct, and it's installed its first post-colonial era penal code, which imposes 2 years of jail time for anyone found to have discriminated against persons based on their sexual orientation. So there is progress there. I want to end with showing you what the Marginal looked like in the early 2000s when I visited, and so you can sort of try to count the number of tall buildings in this picture and compare it with what it looks like now, which is that. And just some final thoughts before I get pulled off stage. Angolans are a people that have been victimized in so many different ways by so many different actors for hundreds of years. But they've maintained their pride, a sense of self, faith, and hope. So I've drawn, similarities to the African-American experience, especially at this time of heightened awareness of the widespread abuses Black Americans have had to endure, many of us silently for most of our lives. So from hundreds of years of enslavement, followed by systematic marginalization and disenfranchisement, and the continuing struggle of poor, marginalized people to matter, it's almost like you don't know which country I'm talking about, given the similarities. History is supposed to keep us from repeating mistakes, but we just keep repeating history. So I thank you for your attention and for tuning in, and I hope we can all be united in learning from our shared world history and work actively to prevent torture and all other cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment.
Thank you so much, Marcelina. We've got some questions starting to come in, so I'll go through these. We had a question about if there's a Jewish population in Angola.
I'm not sure that there is a significant Jewish population in Angola. I'm sure there is some representation, but most of Angola is Christian, in growing Muslim population, and then not much of a Jewish population that I'm aware of.
And somebody wanted to know about you, if you speak other languages. Do you speak Portuguese? Do you speak any of the Bantu languages?
I speak a few other languages very badly. So I grew up in Namibia. So in Namibia, we learned Afrikaans, which I have since forgotten. And then we were in a refugee camp in Botswana for a couple of years and learned Setswana there, which I have since forgotten. Portuguese has been my constant throughout my life, so it's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. And then, you know, just whatever I learned in college, French and Spanish, of course, because it's so similar to Portuguese.
I have a couple of questions about Angola today. So one is about UNITA. Does UNITA still have a presence there?
Yes, absolutely. UNITA is a very active political party in Angola today.
Okay. And the other question was about, you had mentioned the decriminalization of sexual orientation. And there was a question about how that came to be, if it was a grassroots movement or a top-down decision.
Yes, it was definitely, I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but there is one particular organization, a lobby group, gay rights lobby group, that the Angolan government gave legal status to recently. Well, I think it was established in 2013. It's called IRIS Angola, IRIS Angola. And right, they have legal status to operate in Angola, and I'm sure part of their lobbying efforts led to, you know, Angolan government's decision to get rid of this colonial era penal code, basically, that outlawed same-sex conduct.
And can you speak at all to the current influence of the Chinese government and the business community on the Angolan economy and their foreign policy?
The Angolan government has been working with the Chinese for a very long time. And there has been a growing Chinese presence in Angola, not just workers coming in to do some of the work that Chinese companies have been contracted to do, but also residing, taking up residence in country. Beyond that, I don't know that there is much more to say. They've been very, very active in Angola's economy, I will say that. And the Angolan government has turned to the Chinese more than they have turned to Western countries for economic assistance. So that's that.
We had one question just asking if Angola is a democracy at this point, if it's considered, and well, we'll just do that one first, and then I'll move on.
The official title is the People's Republic of Angola. It is considered a democracy.
And also a question about, you mentioned the tourism and how that had not really been developed. So is there any development on that front?
Yeah, it's growing. It's a little bit difficult to explain because Angola is also one of those countries that's for year after year after year has fallen on the list of one of the most expensive countries to live in for expatriates, particularly the city of Luanda. It's almost inaccessible to anyone who doesn't work for one of the oil companies or one of the diamond companies of one of, you know, it's very much a difficult place to visit if you're not connected or in those circles. The Ilha that I showed, the Ilha caters to tourists, definitely, but expect to spend $400 a day renting a hotel room, and expect to spend hundreds of dollars to dine out. So it's really not for the common tourist. Now, there are areas outside of Luanda, beautiful natural wonders that can be visited without huge wads of cash.
There's a question here about whether or not there's been any kind of movement recently to decolonize and Angolicize the language and names and culture, to sort of remove some of the Portuguese influence.
Absolutely. Angola actually almost immediately after independence started reverting to former names for cities, as well as so the local names, as well as for some of the features, natural features in Angola. There was a waterfall in the Malange area, I believe, that was named after a Portuguese duke. That name reverted back. Some of the cities in Angola, those names reverted back. Luanda has always been Luanda because when the Portuguese first arrived, that's what folks who lived in the area called it Loanda, Loanda. They tried for a split second, I think, to call it São Paulo de something of Luanda. It didn't work out, and so they just ended up calling it Luanda.
I have a question just about the flag. If you could explain the Angolan flag, people are curious about that.
It's definitely something that the Angolan government has tried to change over time, and it has not worked out well. I'm going back to show you the flag. Red on top, black on the bottom. That's a katana. How do you say that in English?
Like a machete.
A machete, thank you. As well as, it's a very communist sort of symbology. So I think the government at one point tried to ask folks to submit designs for a new flag, and that did not go well. So they kept the same one.
I'm gonna shift to the Angolan community in the US and St. Louis. So a couple of questions, if you know, approximately how many Angolans have came to the US as refugees, and also had a question about the Angolan community in St. Louis. Is there an active community in St. Louis? And I guess I didn't mention in my intro for you that you are not currently living in St. Louis, although I don't know if that may be changing, but.
Right. Well, I don't know the answer to the first question, how many Angolans have come to the United States as refugees. Ours was not exactly a direct route. So I think when we first arrived, we arrived with 2 other families that we knew that were coming from the same refugee camp. One family ended up in Florida, another family ended up in, I want to say, one of the Carolinas. My mother's also online, so she can probably correct me. And we ended up in St. Louis. Your second question about whether, I'm sorry, what was the second question?
It was about if there is an Angolan community in St. Louis, and what does that look like? Yeah.
The Angolan community in St. Louis is very small. A handful of households, really. And most Angolans have settled in the East Coast, where I currently am. So there are some families in Pennsylvania and Virginia. So in these areas, that's where most Angolans that are living in the United States have sort of migrated to. And
I do have somebody asking about if you could kind of give maybe a brief look at Angolan culture, food, music, things like that. What is, I don't know if that's something you've participated in since you haven't lived there most of your life or all of your life?
Wow. I see. I can tell you, but I'm going to leave things out, and people are going to be upset with me for leaving things out. So Angolan food is, I think, similar to a Mediterranean diet. So you have your rice, a lot of foods that the Portuguese used to cook, we've sort of adopted. Traditionally, we eat the funge. We call it funge. It's, I think more West Africans call it fufu. It's made out of cassava most of the time, but you really can make it out of any other meal, I guess. You could make it out of yellow corn flour or white corn flour or whatever you have on hand, and it's eaten with some sort of stewy thing, usually with meat or with fish or chicken or any of that stewy thing there. Culture, music, just fun-loving. People love to dance. There are all sorts of different styles of dance that we had to learn when we were there and we were horrible at, and everybody reminded us that how horrible we were at dancing anything. Kuduro is one of the more popular things that have the young people excited about. Kizomba is also a form of dance and music. That's my favorite, personally.
And I think on the handout that we'll be sending out or that people can find on the website, there are a couple of musicians, sort of contemporary hip hop musicians that are listed, and a comedian. So if you want to look them up, you can find their names and look them up also. I'll just do a couple things here. So I had a question actually about business opportunities in the United States for Angolan products. And I'm not sure if you have an answer to that, but there's a question about if there are business opportunities for Angolan products. And maybe you're not the person to ask for that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. No. Yeah, can't.
That's all right. And you know what? I'm going to give you one. Oh, actually, you know what? I just can't have one that came through. So it talks about, this person has read the handout and noted that there was a comment about the USSR helping the MPLA and the US supporting UNITA. And they're asking why the war lasted for so long. Says, I understand it likely followed the Cold War, but why so long? And I don't know if you have a perspective on that.
Well, I have to also mention that it really went in sort of fits. So it wasn't continuous. There were a number of efforts and a number of ceasefires that people thought was going to hold, and attempts to appease the other side. But in essence, this was a civil war for control of resources and control of, to really have power over power in Angola. So, neither side could really come to an agreement that satisfied. So they went back to war. That's the sort of short answer to the question. But you can compare it to wars that are ongoing right now. In South Sudan, for example, they've been at each other since 2013. And it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. In CAR, in various places around the world, in Yemen, they're just the wars that keep going. But yeah, it's an interesting question, but it's not a continuous 27 years, I would say.
I think we are just about at the end of our time, Marcelina. We had a lot of good questions. And I know, I'm sure there are probably more, but we are getting to the end. So I want to thank you. Thank you really so much for sharing your personal stories and your perspectives on this. I want to thank also, again, our community collaborators, Bilingual International Assistance Services and the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center. And of course, a big thanks to everyone who tuned in this evening and listened and watched. As a reminder, you can look for that handout to get emailed by tomorrow morning. And also, again, your feedback is really important to us. So don't forget to look for that survey that should have popped up in a separate tab. And I just realized I was supposed to share my screen again so that I could show you the upcoming programs. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. There you go. You can see those coming up. And thank you again for being here this evening. We hope to see you again next time. Thank you so much.